we're returning to the book of Daniel, and I encourage you to follow along in your Bibles with me. And as we begin our study this morning, the question that I want us to ask is this: what great transformation has God done in your life? What great transformation has God done in your life? Or maybe we would look forward, what great transformation is God longing to bring about in your life? That's the title that I've given our message for this morning as we look at Daniel chapter 4, the great transformation. And the image that I want us to use as we begin this study of Daniel chapter 4 is that of a blacksmith. You know, the work of a blacksmith, he has the job of shaping the metal into whatever design the customer or he individually might want. And the recent application of this, I think some of our kids, they've been showing some of you these little project they had while they were in the mountains. They made a knife with a blacksmith. You know, what you learn with grandparents is they do everything they would have told their own kids. No, we're not doing that. So, you know, as they drove by in Pigeon Forge with my kids, they saw a sign, blacksmith, make your own knife. Now, they would have told their own kids, forget it. No, we ain't doing it. Not with grandkids, though. He hit the brakes, spun the car around, we're going back. And over the course of about 45 minutes or so, they worked with a blacksmith, and he would heat up this little piece of metal, and my kids would hammer it out, and they twisted the metal, and they turned it into a tool useful for something. Fortunately, it's not sharp. It's safe, all right? You know, that's the picture, though, of what God does in our lives individually. And many of you could say you know how God has done that in your own heart, that great transformation, that work that He's been doing in your life. Ephesians 2:10 says that we are His workmanship. And so that's the picture that I want us to have as we look at Daniel chapter 4, the great transformation. Now, as we've walked through this study, we've already seen how one character after another has demonstrated that great resolve to serve the Lord. If we go all the way back to the beginning of our study, we started in Daniel chapter 1. We looked at Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, as they found themselves in a new land. They decided, you know what, we are going to live with resolve. Even in the food that we eat, we want to make sure that we honor the Lord. And so they chose to live with resolve. As we move into the second chapter, you'll remember that Daniel lived with resolve. He walked by faith as he interpreted the first dream of Nebuchadnezzar. He said, I'll give the interpretation even before God had given him the answer. He lived with resolve. He walked by faith. As we moved into the third chapter, you'll remember the key story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as they truly faced a literal fiery trial. They decided, you know what, we aren't going to bow down to this image. We're going to serve our God with resolve, and as a result, they were thrown into the fire. But God was faithful. He honored their obedience, and they were delivered from that fiery furnace without even a single smell of smoke on their body. They lived with resolve. Well, as we come now to chapter 4, the focus turns back to our key character, Daniel. We're going to look at his example once again of an individual that lived with resolve. And through his obedience, his faithfulness to God, we're going to see what I believe is a great transformation. We're going to see the work of God just as He's done in our life. He also has done in so many throughout the course of history. And so I want us to begin with this first point you'll see on the overhead. Transformation, though, was hindered by the familiar. Transformation was hindered by the familiar. Before we can get into that story of the great transformation, we're going to see in the life of Nebuchadnezzar that he first of all chose to resist that. Well, there's been a bit of time passed before we read our text. Because this story is going to talk about the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, we know that somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 years has passed from chapter 3 now to chapter 4. And so young Daniel that came as this young child and young leader, and he now has turned probably mid-40s or 50. We imagine he's continued to live faithfully before the Lord. Well, now, and he's grown into an adult at this point, he has now a new challenge that's going to be presented to him. Nebuchadnezzar is going to have another dream. And this second dream is going to illustrate this first point, that transformation, first of all, was hindered by the familiar. I want you to look there in chapter 4, verse 1 down to verse 7. It's going to begin with Nebuchadnezzar of all people telling the story, and he offers an introduction. He says, Nebuchadnezzar the king, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I thought it good to declare the signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for me. How great are His signs, and how mighty His wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and His dominion is from generation to generation. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in my house, and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream which made me afraid, and the thoughts of my bed and the visions of my head troubled me. Therefore I issued a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Then the magicians, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers came in, and I told them the dream, but they did not make known to me its interpretation. As we look at these first 7 verses here, I want us to keep in mind this first point. Transformation was, first of all, hindered by the familiar. And when we look at this story here, if you've been with us over the last few weeks, you say, this kind of sounds familiar. I think we've already read this, Michael. You forgot. You've already preached this message. No, it's just coming back to very familiar territory here. And the story begins to unfold in a very familiar way. As the king was troubled with this dream, he goes back to that same route of calling in all of the wise men. Surely they'll be the ones that can give me the interpretation of the dream. And we see this great contrast that takes place here in this story. Notice how the story begins here. He says, I thought it good to declare, or it's my joy to declare this. And so before he gets into all of this story that's going to unfold in this very familiar territory, what a contrast we have, though, at the beginning. Nebuchadnezzar begins with this statement about God. He is concerned about all that has happened, but apparently we get kind of a narrative before the story. He says, I thought it good. It's my joy to declare. That's the beginning of that clue that tells me a great transformation has taken place. He's excited to share what God has done in his life. And folks, when we think about what God has done in our hearts, how He has changed us, it's our joy to declare it. Well, there's a great contrast here of the story. As we look, it says it's his joy to share this story, but, as we look at the unfolding story, he says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in my house, flourishing in my palace. He begins telling us the story that's going to unfold throughout chapter 4, and the beginning is, everything was great. Nebuchadnezzar was at the height of his power at this point. He now has come to the end of his reign. The conflicts in his territories has now come to a close. His building projects have now been completed. Everything was wonderful, and so he could sit back and say, these are the good days. Oh, how wonderful it is to be me. And as he sat back and thought, I just get to sit back and count all of my wonderful blessings, we see a great contrast that happens in our story, because as it moves from this point here of him saying, I'm flourishing in my palace, we see a dream once again comes to his mind. He says, therefore, I issued a decree. Now, why did he issue this decree? Well, because once again, a disturbing image, a dream came to his mind. And as this disturbing contrast took place of at rest in his palace, and now a dream once again, he says, I know the answer. I'll go down the only way I know to answer this, familiar territory. I issued a decree to all of the wise men, the soothsayers, the magicians, the Chaldeans. They'll come in, they'll give me the answer. Now, isn't it interesting when we think about the story of Nebuchadnezzar, what a difficult character he is to learn his lessons. Again and again, we've seen this example, but why would Nebuchadnezzar turn back to this? Well, this was what was familiar. This was what was comfortable. You see, the wise men that he was calling in, they had been taught to worship the God of Nebuchadnezzar, and so he began where he was most comfortable. I began with calling in those that would call on my God. Surely they'll be the one that will give me the answer. And as he called them in, he found out very quickly that they couldn't give him the answer he was longing to hear. Why? Because it was a vision that was given to him by God, and it was God alone that was going to give him the answer. And so he realized there was only one that could come in, and it was that individual named Daniel. Before we look at how Daniel was faithful in giving that interpretation once again, I wonder how many times, though, when we look at Nebuchadnezzar and we say, stubborn old Nebuchadnezzar, I wonder how many times our own hearts are just as stubborn. God has worked in our past, God has moved in our lives, and yet we find ourselves going back down familiar roads when God is calling us to a new work, a new way of seeing His answer. Maybe in your life you've experienced a difficult time. Maybe you're in the midst of that right now, and you've been trying to solve that situation in your own strength. I'm going to make this right. I'm going to fix this. And yet what God is telling you and He's teaching you through this difficult time is that I alone, I'm the only answer to your situation. Nebuchadnezzar, he decided, you know what? I've got the answer. I trained these wise men. I brought them up into how to come in and teach me all of the wonderful mysteries of life. And so he calls them in, and in his own strength he failed. How many of us today can say that? In my own strength, I came to the end of my rope. I realized that in my efforts I was going to fail. And at that point, I realized it was God alone that was going to be the answer to my challenge. Folks, as we look at the story of Nebuchadnezzar, we see that transformation was hindered by the familiar. Transformation was hindered by him longing to keep the same. Let's do it the same way we've always done it. I wonder how God is longing to do a new work in our midst, and yet we cling to that which was familiar. Well, the familiar didn't work out too well for Nebuchadnezzar as he called in the wise men, as he called in the magicians, the soothsayers, all of these wonderful titled individuals. They gave him nothing. Where is Daniel? Where in the world is Daniel? Here's an opportunity for Daniel to come in and be the answer to this situation, but Daniel is nowhere to be found. I think that's by design. And I think at times God does that in our own life by design. He allows us to go to the very end of our efforts. And when we're willing to say, God, I give up, we then say, God, you take over. God, you be the one that takes over this situation. And so as we look at our text, it's interesting when we look down at verse 8, it says this, But at last, Daniel came before me. His name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God. In him is the Spirit of the Holy God. And I told him the dream before him, saying, and he began to explain the dream. Daniel, you're late. No, I think Daniel was right on time. And so many times we question God's timing, and yet we never look at the picture of what God is doing in the midst of that difficult time in our heart to say, God, what were you trying to teach me in the midst of the trial? And when I came to the end of that, Lord, I see now your timing was perfect. Daniel's timing was perfect because at this point, Nebuchadnezzar had already given up on everything that was according to his own plans, his own way of answering this problem here. And so transformation was hindered by the familiar. But then we see Daniel stepping in, and as he came in, everything began to change. God was about to do a new work, reminding Nebuchadnezzar that God alone was on the throne. Listen to this passage from Isaiah. This is something that's been taught throughout Scripture. God said to Isaiah, Behold, I will do a new thing. Now it shall spring forth. Shall you not know it? I will even make a new road in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. Folks, I wonder today, as we consider transformation might just be hindered by the familiar, are we praying, God, what is that new thing you're longing to do in our midst? That's the beginning point for Nebuchadnezzar. When he went back to familiar roads, his quest was frustrated. But when he opened his eyes that God alone was the one who had given him this vision, and God alone was going to use Daniel to interpret that, things began to change. Look at our second point this morning. Transformation, then, was exemplified by the faithful. Transformation was exemplified by the faithful. Obviously, that faithful individual, Daniel. Daniel, once again, stands tall as a wonderful example for us. That no matter what challenge he faced in the narrative of this story, we see that Daniel was faithful to God. Now, we could read all of the story of his dream, but let me explain it to you very simply here. This was the dream that Nebuchadnezzar brought before all the people. And you'll notice what's different about this story is he didn't withhold the dream this time. He shared it openly. He shared it with the wise men. He shared it with Daniel. And so the wise men could have been really wise about it and said, well, let me just take a guess. But they realized if this went wrong, this is bad. And they stepped back and said, we can't do it. Well, he shared the dream again, and this was the dream. It was the picture of a grand tree built in the midst of the land. This is the picture of the tree in the midst of Disney's Animal Kingdom. And that's kind of a picture of this vision that he has. Just like in the Animal Kingdom, that tree is right at the center of the entire park. That was the dream that Nebuchadnezzar was given by God, that this huge, massive tree was the vision of Nebuchadnezzar given to him by God, right at the center of the kingdom. It was a place where all of the animals could come. Its tree, its leaves were bountiful. It was a place of shade, and so everyone looked to that tree as a symbol of power. But then the voice coming from heaven said this, chop down that tree. Leave nothing but the stump. And we'll talk about all of the meaning found in this. And you say, well, that's destructive. That's pretty difficult to take in. Well, it goes even further. He says something about the subject in that dream was going to be forced out among the animals. He not only was going to lose his kingdom, but apparently lose his mind as well. Well, that was the vision that was given to Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel was the one that was called in to say, what now is the meaning of this vision? What is this all about? Well, let's pick up then in verse 19. Let's look at how Daniel now steps onto the stage and begins explaining this second dream. It says this, then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for a time, and his thoughts troubled him. So the king spoke and said, Belteshazzar, do not let this dream or its interpretation trouble you. Belteshazzar answered and said, my lord, may the dream concern those who hate you, and its interpretation concern your enemies. The tree that you saw, which grew and became strong, whose height reached to the heavens, and which could be seen by all the earth, whose leaves were lovely and its fruit abundant, and which was food for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and in whose branches the birds of heaven had their home. It is you, O king, who have grown and become strong, for your greatness has grown and reaches to the heavens, and your dominion to the end of the earth. And inasmuch as the king saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven and saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave its stump and roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let him graze with the beasts of the field, till 7 times pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king. They shall drive you from men. Your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make you eat grass like oxen. They shall wet you with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and gives it to whomever He chooses. That's the picture of the dream. Daniel is called in to interpret the dream. You know, it's sometimes difficult to give the tough news. And those of you who have served in any kind of managerial roles, you know the difficult time of sharing news with those who work under you. Maybe it was passed down to you by the boss to say, it's time for cutbacks. You've got to share the news. This person has to go. And you're given that responsibility of sharing that news, and you can experience the heavy weight of that news. And that's the picture here of Daniel. It says as we begin there in verse 19, he says he was astonished by the news. You see, Daniel took this very personally because he knew the very one that he was serving alongside. This was a very tragic announcement that was given to King Nebuchadnezzar. The word was that his kingdom was about to come to an end, and Daniel didn't want to share it. He was astonished by this word. But you know what we see again by Daniel's example is this. He exemplified faithfulness. Even when the news was tough, even when the call of God was difficult, Daniel knew that God had chosen him for that very moment, for that very purpose. And so Daniel chose not to comfort the ears of Nebuchadnezzar. He chose instead to be faithful. And you know, as I think about this process of transformation we see coming about in the life of Nebuchadnezzar, I wonder how often God longs to use each and every one of us in the life of maybe our family members, maybe a friend, a co-worker, and God gives us that challenge, share a word of encouragement. We say, oh, I don't want to disrupt our workflow. I don't want to be seen as a Jesus freak or a zealot for God, and I'll just stay quiet. Imagine if Daniel would have remained quiet in this moment. Nebuchadnezzar's transformation certainly in God's sovereignty would have come about, but maybe it would have taken a different course. But because of Daniel's faithfulness, God was able to use him as that key character to carry out God's plan. God longs to use each and every one of us. And here in the story we see that Daniel was faithful, and the difficult message began there in verses 20 and 21. He begins to lay out to him this massive tree that was going to grow in the midst of the kingdom, could be seen by all of the earth. But then the news comes, chop down that tree. The picture is of a voice coming from heaven, obviously the voice of God, delivered through an angel saying, this tree must be chopped down, your kingdom must come to an end. And the word is that there would be nothing left but a stump. Picture of, yes, his kingdom would remain. We're going to read next week about the kingdom that moves on after Nebuchadnezzar, but the word is very clear. He says to Nebuchadnezzar, you are that man. You know, as we think about those words, Daniel had to share with Nebuchadnezzar, you are that man. Takes my mind back to another story in the Old Testament, in the story of Nathan and David. Nathan came before David and he began to share about a story of a rich man that had a guest come into the town, and instead of taking out of his abundance, he took from the poor man. Well, David was outraged. The king sat on his throne and he said, who is this person? Make sure that they're judged for their actions. And Nathan had to turn to David and said, you, O king, you are that man. I often have experienced that in my own life when I've been frustrated maybe by those around me, and God begins to stir my heart to say, it's not the others you need to be looking at, it's yourself. So many times God turns the spotlight right back on our own lives when we're looking so often at others all around us. God says, you are that man. You are that woman that I'm longing to speak to. And as Nebuchadnezzar heard this word, Daniel agreed with him in saying, I hope this is about your enemies. But he knew it wasn't. He knew this was about Nebuchadnezzar. And he said, King, it is you. You're the one that needs to understand this message. It applies to you. Look at verse 23 as it continues. And inasmuch as the king saw a watcher, a holy one coming down from heaven, saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave its stump and roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field. The story was clear. Nebuchadnezzar had bragged about, I am the most powerful king in all the land. Nothing could change my rule. And now he was hearing that there was one so much greater than himself. He was about to lose everything as God demonstrated to him. There is a king greater than anything in this world. Folks, when we get so caught up in our situations of life, in the quest for success, the quest for just accomplishments in this life, I think we need this reminder. There is a God seated on the throne so much greater than anything we're facing. That's in our success, but it's also in our difficulties when we're so wrapped up in all that's going on. What a mess I find myself in. This will never be fixed. God says, I'm still on the throne. Nothing's changed where I am in heaven, and that was the case with Nebuchadnezzar. Here he looked at himself and he prided himself. He said, I've reached the height of power. And God reminded him there is one so much greater who was seated on his throne. Transformation was needed in this moment, and it was exemplified by the faithful one, Daniel. Faithful even once again, bringing the difficult news of God's judgment. Let's look at our third point this morning. Transformation was now needed for the fearful. Transformation was needed for the fearful. Look again, just one more time at verse 25. I think this is a key transition here. It says there, they shall drive you from men. Your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. And they shall make you eat grass like oxen. They shall wet you with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and gives it to whomever He chooses. Now, you talk about strange pictures in the Bible. God went to very strange means here and to lengths to prove to Nebuchadnezzar that, no, you aren't the highest king of all the world. No, there is one greater. In fact, he demonstrated this through basically turning Nebuchadnezzar not from a king in his royal palace. No, he was like the animals out grazing on the earth. It's a wild picture here for sure in many ways. It says 7 times shall pass over you. And the picture here is 7 years is the belief that for this period of time, King Nebuchadnezzar not only lost his kingdom, he also lost his mind. There's a psychological description of this, of getting to the point where you believe you're nothing more than an animal. Folks, Nebuchadnezzar no longer was at the height and the awe of everyone in the kingdom. He was at the lowest of low, out grazing with the animals. God was getting the attention of an arrogant king. Well, let's keep going in the story in verse 25, or 26 rather. We'll pick up let's skip down a little bit to verse 29. It says, at the end of the 12 months, this is what Nebuchadnezzar did to bring about this. He was walking about the royal palace of Babylon. The king spoke, saying, is not this great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty? While the word was still in the king's mouth, a voice fell from heaven. King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you. Verse 32, and they shall drive you from men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make you eat grass like oxen, and 7 times shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and gives it to whomever He chooses. That very hour the word was fulfilled concerning Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from men, and ate grass like oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hair had grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws. What a vivid picture here of the king now taken down from his throne, put out among the animals. Why would God do such a strange course of events here? Well, because Nebuchadnezzar had gone to the point of saying, there is none like me. This kingdom has been built for my majesty. And in that moment, he allowed those events to bring about one thing in the life of King Nebuchadnezzar, humility. You know, folks, I believe we all agree today, Lord, don't take me to this point to bring about humility in my life. Help me to come just in a time of worship like this to realize that you are God of heaven. You are the King of kings. That's why we were singing this morning about our incredible King. I want to say today, God, you are on the throne, and so we come in humility saying, God, we yield our lives to you. Don't bring about difficult situations in our life to force us to that conclusion. Help us today to realize, God, you are the King. Folks, we see here that transformation was needed in the life of the fearful. We look at the situation here. Nebuchadnezzar found himself banished. We find him out among the animals. And as God brought about these events, it wasn't God that caused the sin, but God used that process in his life to gain the attention of Nebuchadnezzar. Listen to what the Bible says about us in the New Testament. James 1, 12 through 14. It says, blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. You see, Nebuchadnezzar's action brought about this very clear judgment of God, but it wasn't God that brought about his sin. It was God that brought about the very judgment that would draw him back. Folks, we realize that our sin is a very real thing that takes us away from the Lord. Some of you may know the movie The Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring, and in that first movie, that picture of the ring is a picture of evil. And in the Fellowship of the Ring, those that are supposed to carry about the ring, supposed to carry it to its doom or its destruction, they find that they're drawn into the ring. The very ones that were supposed to guard it are drawn in. They realize its evil desire has pulled them in. That's a picture of what James has talked about. as we're drawn in by our evil desires, it leads to our destruction. Nebuchadnezzar began maybe very innocently, but in the end it became one thing. It was all about Nebuchadnezzar, and in that moment he became the most needy individual of all for transformation. And so I want us to look at the transformation that took place. Let's look at the story as it ends in verse 34. And at the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored Him who lives forever. For His dominion is an everlasting dominion, and His kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to His will in the army of heaven. And among the inhabitants of the earth, no one can restrain His hand or say to Him, "What have you done?" At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my honor and splendor returned to me. My counselors and nobles resorted to me. I was restored to my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all of whose works are truth, and His ways are justice. And those who walk in pride, He is able to put down. Folks, what an amazing transformation. Nebuchadnezzar, it's all about me. It's all about my kingdom. And Nebuchadnezzar, of all people, is recorded in Scripture as saying, He alone is the King of kings. Was Nebuchadnezzar saved? Will we see Nebuchadnezzar in heaven? We don't know. It's debated about, was this his moment of salvation? Folks, I'm going to step out on a limb here and say absolutely. I believe we're going to see Nebuchadnezzar dancing with the Lord saying, "You are the King of kings. You are Lord of lords." I believe he was transformed. We see no more of the narrative of Nebuchadnezzar. We see his last words being words of praise. Why did God allow this king to record this testimony in Scripture? Well, I believe it's because this is a story of a great transformation. Has He moved in such a way in your life that you could tell about this great transformation? I hope so. I hope we would look at the situations in our life, the moments in our life like a blacksmith shop, that maybe God has been putting us into the fire and shaping us for a purpose because He longs to bring about a great transformation. Maybe you would say, "Well, I've got a loved one, and they're just so far gone, I don't know that anything can be done." Wouldn't you have said that of Nebuchadnezzar? Of all people, the highest king of the land, to stand back and say, "He is greater." Sure, you restored to me all these things. That's wonderful. These are our blessings, but you alone are God. Folks, if He can do it in the life of Nebuchadnezzar, He can do it in the life of anyone, even us today. You see, I believe we need to pray today, "God, what is that new work You're longing to do? Don't help me to cling to what is familiar. Help me to say today, God, if that transformation means I'm going to walk a new path today, I look forward to what You have in store for me." That's our desire today. And folks, there is a route that allows us to experience that. It's not through our works. It's not through what we're able to say today, "I'm going to be more disciplined. I'm going to do better at this." No, we say it's only through the cross of Christ. That is the means for change in each of our lives today. Let's pray a word of commitment now. Lord, as we look at the